Good afternoon and welcome to our presentation, our speaker series presentation. My name is Melinda Knuth and I am the Violence Prevention Coordinator for Madison, Dane County Public Health. And I am sorry to say that as much as I had everything prepared today, I lost my notes. So I'm trying to find them quickly in my computer. So I do apologize. I had them minimized so I could bring them up, but I somehow must have closed them. So I'm just bringing that up very quickly. There's always a tech issue of some kind. Okay. Okay, I'm very sorry for the pause. I don't know what my computer is doing. So, all right. So I apologize for that. Start over. Again, I already said my name was Melinda Knuth and I'm the Violence Prevention Coordinator here at Public Health. And I'm going to go over a few things while we give folks some time to join in. We are having this speaker series in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and our session today will focus on domestic violence. First, I wanted to give a quick overview of the format for today. This Zoom event is scheduled from noon to 1 p.m. Central Time. The format today will be a 40 to 50-minute presentation, followed by question and answer. During the presentation, please put any questions that come up into the Q&A or chat function of your Zoom. I will be monitoring the chat and will assist with getting your questions to our speaker for response. If it works, I will politely interrupt her and ask that question that's relevant to the portion of this presentation she is giving. Otherwise, I will save them for the end. But at the end of the presentation, we'll also have additional time for Q&A, again, using the chat feature or the Q&A feature on your Zoom. And at the very end, I'm going to place a quick survey in the chat at the end of the session. So if you have a minute, not even a minute, 30 seconds or so before you log off at the end of this Zoom presentation to complete that, we would very much appreciate it. And we will be using the information gathered in that survey to guide planning for future events. So our event today is the 5th in our speaker series. Those of you who may have joined in for previous sessions know that this series was launched over the summer by the Madison, Dane County Public Health Violence Prevention Unit. The goals of this series are to enable community members and organizations to learn best practices and latest theories for violence prevention, provide education on the public health model for violence prevention, and to highlight violence prevention work being done in the community to help foster collaboration. We previously hosted sessions on gun violence prevention and responsible gun ownership, youth internet and social media safety, back to school safety, and a recent panel discussion on youth engagement and connection. Recordings and information about those past sessions can be found on the Madison Dane County Public Health website under the heading Community Initiatives. This event is also being recorded and will be made available on the website. The work of the Violence Prevention Unit at Public Health is centered around the Roadmap to Reducing Violence, a collaborative document that was released by the city and county in March of 2021. The roadmap focuses on 5 primary goals of violence prevention. Goal 2 of the roadmap seeks to support community engagement with children, youth, and families, with one of the primary strategies being to expand intimate partner violence and sexual assault primary prevention programming. Goal 4 seeks to bolster and increase intervention and continuous healing for those affected by violence. Domestic Abuse Intervention Services, DAIS, is a local organization engaged in this work. We believe it is important to hear from them, learn from them, and look for ways our community can further support and expand their efforts. Our speaker today is Zoe Heitzinger. Zoe is the Prevention and Outreach Coordinator at DAIS. Zoe's work at DAIS focuses on 2 programs focused on primary prevention advocacy and outreach and education. She runs Men's Encouraging Nonviolent Strength, the Men's Club, with middle and high school male identified youth to support this population ending gender-based violence, while also having a safe place to talk about growing up male and forming healthy male identity. Zoe also gives presentations to any group, including but not limited to organizations, work sites, faith-based organizations, and schools, on any topic related to domestic and intimate partner violence. You can contact information will be provided during this session and in a follow-up email, so you can contact DAIS for more information about their services. And without further delay, I will pass the microphone to Zoe.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Melinda. I just have some thanks to give before I even get into my presentation. Many thanks to all of you for being here. Many thanks to all of you for logging on, either giving up some of your lunch hour, or if you're joining me and including me in your lunch hour, many thanks to that. Also, many thanks to Public Health Madison, Dane County as well for setting up this speaker series. I just think it's awesome and a super cool model of getting to know other organizations and topics in our community. So thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So once again, Zoe Heitzinger, Prevention Outreach Coordinator, and today I'll be talking to you all about domestic and intimate partner violence. So before I get into some of the content that I've brought you all today, I wanted just to set some guidelines for the presentation. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence can be and are very triggering topics to talk about. And so I just want to make sure that we are all keeping ourselves and each other as safe as possible in this space today. So number one being safety for self. If at any point you need to take a break, if you need to mute me on your end, if you need to use the restroom, grab some food, if you need to doodle, I invite you to do all of that. I invite you to do whatever keeping yourself safe looks like for you. Second, safety for others. If we are asking questions or sharing questions or anecdotes or wisdom or experiences at any point in this presentation, please make sure that we are also just keeping community safety in mind and that we are not sharing any identifying information about other community members, about clients that we are working with, just to, again, make sure we're keeping safety and confidentiality at the forefront. Lastly, just a note on gendered language. So statistically, we have heard and we know that almost the most prevalent statistic that exists around domestic violence is that 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. However, that is not the only population, that is not the only gender identity that experiences intimate partner violence. So throughout this presentation, you will see some gendered graphics, you will see some gendered statistics, but I will also be changing that language as much as possible to they, them pronouns, or to language such as partner who experienced violence and partner who is choosing to use violence. And that is intentional just to bring in as many voices and as many experiences into the conversation today as possible. So thank you all. So just to give an overview and a plan of where we're going today, what I'll be talking with you all about, I'm going to go through some of this 101 content, the terminology, the statistics, and the power and control wheel. And then I'll move into the barriers that somebody might face in disclosing or reporting or even leaving their partner. And then I'll go through how to support survivors in our community, especially with a note on how to support survivors as we are working as service providers, for those of you who are joining the call. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with DAIS services and how to access those services and what referrals and all of that looks like. But again, as Melinda mentioned, please feel free to put all of the questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and she will get those to me, and I will hopefully answer all of them as they come up. So thank you all for that. All right, just to jump right in, language matters when we talk about domestic violence, intimate partner violence. A lot of us, and probably most of us, have heard of domestic violence and domestic abuse. Those two phrases, those two terms are the legal terminology for what the crime is. Domestic violence, domestic abuse refer to two people in a home setting, whether that be a marital spouse, a long-term partner, or a roommate. And it includes stalking, physical violence, sexual violence, financial violence, and emotional violence as well. Intimate partner violence is a term that I'm only assuming a lot of you are like, well, aren't they the same thing? Or don't these all mean the same thing? Yes, and intimate partner violence just brings more folks into the conversation, more experiences into the conversation, because some people might be experiencing this form of violence, but not live with their partner. It might be a long distance relationship. It might be an only digital or online relationship, or it might be teens, because oftentimes teens are not living with their partners, but they could still be experiencing these forms of violence. And then lastly, victim versus survivor. It is always up to the person experiencing this type of violence to decide how they would like to identify and at what point in their journey. So some people strongly do not want to be identified as victims, and some people strongly want to be identified as survivors. Our executive director, Shannon Berry, always mentions, that survivors of intimate partner violence are the strongest and most resilient people we have ever met. So we don't want to further victimize them if they don't, agree with that identity. But throughout this presentation, you will hear me use those kind of interchangeably. But again, as we're working with folks impacted by this violence, making sure that we're checking in with them to how they would like to identify. And so what is intimate partner violence? What is domestic violence? This is the definition that we operate under at DAIS. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence is the intentional use of power and control tactics by one intimate partner over the other in order to create an environment of fear and intimidation. And we have those purple words, purple and bold, for a reason, starting with the intentional use. At its core, domestic violence and intimate partner violence is a choice that somebody is making. And I know I get, kind of a lot of sideways looks or a lot of like, wait a second, what do you mean? And when I say choice, right, I don't always mean that it's a conscious choice. I don't always mean that it's a choice that somebody is making intentionally. It might be exacerbated. It might be escalated by certain things. For example, there are 3 common myths that exist around domestic violence. One of them is that domestic violence is caused by substance use. One of them is that intimate partner violence or domestic violence is caused by anger management. And one of them is that intimate partner violence or domestic violence is caused by a mental health diagnosis. All 3 of those things are false. They are false myths. When we think about it and break it down, if I take one of those, I'm just going to take substance abuse, for example. Somebody could be experiencing a substance use issue or disorder such as alcoholism, and they could go to AA and they could do a 12-step program and they could become sober. But just because the drinking might stop, it doesn't mean that the abuse on their partner stops at home. And same thing maybe with anger management. Someone could go to anger management classes and learn how to cope with anger and learn healthy coping mechanisms for their anger. But that doesn't mean that just because the anger might subside in, a workplace setting or in, everyday life, it doesn't mean that that anger stops with their partner. And again, we also don't want to further stigmatize any of those communities as well, too, specifically talking about mental health and mental health diagnoses. We don't want to further stigmatize that community by thinking that everybody who is inherently dealing with a mental health diagnosis is inherently abusive, or that anybody who is abusive is inherently dealing with a mental health diagnosis. We don't want to further stigmatize. And then it's the usage of the power and control tactics that I will get into in just a second, but it's really creating that environment of fear and intimidation that prevents somebody from feeling safe enough to leave, to come forward, to disclose, to access resources. It is that creation of that toxic environment that, essentially traps somebody in the cycle. And then lastly, at the bottom here, I have that domestic violence occurs in all populations, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, education status, religious beliefs, geography, or ability or disability. There is no one population that is quote unquote spared from domestic violence. And now I'm going to take us through some statistics, and I just want to give a reminder to please take care of yourselves as I'm going through these. If this is the first time you are hearing some of these, they might be hard to hear. So again, please do what you need to do to keep yourself safe. This is the current most updated statistic from the CDC around intimate partner violence. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men in the United States will be a victim during their lifetime. But that number goes up exponentially for the trans community. And that number goes up to 1 in 2 for the trans identifying community, that somebody who identifies as transgender will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And that is just a heartbreaking statistic to me. Most cases of domestic violence are never reported to the police. If anything, domestic violence, intimate partner violence are some of the most underreported crimes that exist. And when we get into the barriers at the end of this presentation, there are a lot of things that exist around somebody, again, feeling safe enough to disclose or to come forward or to report. Data from the U.S. Crime Report suggests that about 1 in 5 homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. And on a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. And that is any given day of the week. We're looking at 20,000 calls. But what does this mean locally? What does this look like for our community in Dane County? It means of the 253,000 women and girls who call Dane County home, over 63,000 of them have been or will be the victim of domestic violence at some point in their lives. And like I had mentioned, nationwide rates of 20,000 calls a day, But we saw around 7,000 total calls to our DAIS helpline in 2021. So just reflecting that it's happening in our community and that it's prevalent in our community as well. And in 2021, domestic violence claimed 80 lives in the state of Wisconsin. This number comes from the End Abuse Homicide Report that is put out at the end of each year. They do a beautiful job and a very intentional job writing this report. And not only does it include the demographics, and kind of the statistics, but it also includes a beautiful memorial of whose lives were lost as well. And same from that same report, domestic violence homicides took place at a rate of 1 death every 4.5 days in 2021. And lastly, DAIS estimates that there are around 12,000 incidents of domestic violence in Dane County annually, or around 33 happening per day. So again, it is happening in our community. It is here. It is a community issue. And so now I'm going to take us through, oh yeah, I see Melinda popped on.
Sorry, I popped on with a quick question. I was wondering if those statistics are the direct victim of a domestic violence incident, or do they include potentially other, I'm just thinking of our recent events, I guess, in Waukesha. Would events with situations like that were related to a domestic violence incident, whether it's injury or homicide, be included in statistics? And maybe you can't answer that. Maybe I need to go to End Abuse.
Yes. So for the 80 lives being lost in Wisconsin in 2021, that number 80 includes if the perpetrator killed themselves and if children were killed as well too. Specifically speaking to the incidents and the estimates that DAIS has on our end, this is kind of a mix of our helpline calls versus, police data that we have as well. So it might not just be, a severe form of violence, but an incident that happens. And definitely it includes if something impacts the family unit as a whole as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. Alrighty, so now I'm going to take us through the cycle of violence. This often answers that question. How does this start? How does somebody get into one of these relationships? How does this happen? Oftentimes, as many relationships do, it starts in the honeymoon phase where everything feels great, everything feels good. This person checks your boxes. You just enjoy being around this person. And then that honeymoon phase transitions into this tension building phase where we see this person who maybe checked all of those boxes, who is amazing and wonderful. Maybe they start becoming more moody or more nitpicky. Maybe isolation starts to happen. Maybe withdrawing affection starts to happen where that person goes from texting, all times or calling all day to not a lot, just that general withdrawing of affection. Maybe yelling starts to happen that wasn't there before. Maybe substance use, threats, destruction of property. But this is when that person experiencing this violence can go into a trauma response state of fawn or appeasement. And we have heard the most common, trauma responses of fight, flight, and freeze. We like to include fawn or appeasement in this as well. Fawn or appeasement trauma response essentially just means that somebody is doing everything they can to control the environment to ensure that violence does not escalate. So maybe it's attempting to calm that other partner down. Maybe it is staying away from the family and friends. Maybe it is keeping the kids quiet if kids are starting to notice. Maybe it's agreeing with everything that person says or does. Maybe that person starts to withdraw inward themselves, trying to reason, cooking a favorite meal, constantly cleaning the house. It's this general feeling of walking on eggshells around that other person. And then that tension builds and transitions into an explosion phase. And that can be what we see on the screen here with these examples of physical and sexual violence that I'm not going to read out loud. But the explosion phase or a moment of violence can also be, yelling at somebody in the middle of a grocery store. It can be putting down a partner in front of family or friends. It's anything that threatens that emotional and physical well-being and safety of a person can be considered this explosion phase or this moment of violence. And then as we know how cycles work, then that goes right back into the honeymoon phase where that partner who was choosing to use these acts of violence says things like, I'm so sorry, baby, I promise I'll be better, or I promise I'll change, or I promise we'll go to counseling, or I promise I'll go to this program. Maybe it's this idea of love bombing, right? Where all of a sudden it's all of these texts in a row and so many declarations of love. Maybe it's showing up at work with flowers or chocolate or whatever it might be. And again, this is when that person experiencing the violence starts to become trapped in this cycle, right? Because maybe it is agreeing to stay or to return or to take that person back. Maybe it is, attempting to stop legal proceedings or to cancel the restraining order. Maybe it's setting up that counseling appointment or therapy to make that person feel hopeful. And then that cycle just repeats. And on average, it takes somebody 7 times to leave an abusive partner before they are actually able to leave. And 7 is an incredibly high average to have. I think about, doing 7 things, or doing something 7 times in a row, and I'm already exhausted, let alone having to worry about leaving or finding safety in leaving an abusive partner. And that, this is important because each phase might be followed by periods of calm. There is no linear time scale to this cycle. So the honeymoon phase could last 4 years before tension starts to build and another 2 years before a moment of violence or the explosion phase happens. This could be a matter of months, a matter of weeks. There is no linear time scale to this. And that, not all domestic violence or intimate partner violence relationships fit neatly into this cycle. Everybody's experience with domestic violence and intimate partner violence is different because intimate partner violence is a type of trauma, and we all cope with trauma. We all experience trauma differently. So while this cycle is a great representation, and I love this graphic, it might not be everybody's experience. And now I'm going, actually, I have one more thing to say. I brought in this quote from the #WhyIStayed campaign that was on Twitter a couple of years before the Me Too movement started to happen. And I'll bring some examples of tweets later in this presentation, but this quote does a beautiful job talking about what this cycle feels like in real life. So it says, abuse usually isn't consistent or constant. So in between, you become a normal couple. You plan dinner, you go to work, you watch TV. Whenever there's a break in the violence, whether it's emotional or physical, you are lulled into a sense of complacency. And I just think that quote does a great job talking about what this cycle can feel like for somebody who's in it. And now I'm going to take us through the power and control wheel. So this is the general power and control wheel that we use. And if we think back to the definition at the beginning of the presentation, intimate partner violence is the intentional use of these power and control tactics. So before I go through the wheel, I just want to note the makeup that each of these wedges, again, are tactics of power and control. But then there's that ring on the outside that says physical and sexual violence. And that is to show that even if physical and sexual violence are not happening in the relationship, the threat of them could always be there. Or that if one of these wedges may be escalated enough, or if these tactics escalated enough, it could lead to physical or sexual violence. So again, you'll notice that this wheel is gendered. It paints female victim, male perpetrator. But again, I'll be changing those pronouns as I'm going through the wheel. So if we start at the top with using coercion and threats, it's making and or carrying out threats to do something to hurt that other person, threatening to leave, threatening to commit suicide, threatening to report to a government agency such as welfare or CPS or ICE, making that person drop charges and making them do illegal things that they don't want to do. Then we have using intimidation, so making somebody afraid by using looks, actions, or gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, and displaying weapons. Then we have using emotional abuse. So putting that person down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them think they're crazy, a form of gaslighting. And for those of you, who are joining and you're like, oh my gosh, gaslighting, she just said it, it's a buzzword. A lot of us, I've realized, don't actually know what gaslighting is. So gaslighting takes a little bit of influencing someone's environment and then denying their reality as a result. So saying things like, you're remembering it wrong, I never said that, or it's not that serious, it was, I might not have hit you that hard, you're faking, or you're making it up. It's gaslighting somebody's experience. And then we have, playing mind games, humiliation, and making that person feel guilty as well. And using emotional abuse is one of, if not the most rampant forms of abuse that can exist. It is the also hardest to quote unquote prove in a legal setting. Then we have using isolation, so controlling what a person does, who they see, who they talk to, what they read, where they go, what media they're allowed to consume, maybe what music they're allowed to listen to. It's really limiting that outside involvement and using jealousy, and I would also go as far as to say safety, to justify those actions as well. Then we have minimizing, denying, and blaming. So making light of the abuse and not taking concerns about it seriously, saying that the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for the abusive behavior, and saying that the other person caused it. That if they wouldn't have just done X, they wouldn't have had to respond with Y, that type of thinking. And then we have using children, so making that other parent or other partner feel guilty about the children or what the children might be seeing or hearing. It could be using the children to relay messages from the non-abusive parent to the abusive parent. It could be using visitation to harass that person, or it could be using custody exchange placement as a time to harass that partner. And it could also be threatening to take the children away or threatening to report that person to CPS. And then we have using male privilege. And I'm going to pause on this for a second, because those of you who are joining on this call who identify as male, I am not directly attempting to blame any of you in this on a lot of other wheels that we have, because again, this is just the general power and control wheel, but we have an LGBTQ power and control wheel. We have an immigration power and control wheel. We have a power and control wheel for almost any population. And on different wheels, this wedge is simply just using privilege. And so that's how I'm going to talk about it today. But why this is included on this general wheel, why male privilege is included, is because we live in a patriarchy. Men are afforded privileges that a lot of people in our society are not afforded. So that is why it's included. And this can look like treating somebody like a servant, making all of the big decisions, acting like the quote unquote master of the castle, and being the one to define the men's and women's roles or just the general roles of the relationship. It can also be using that privilege to leverage this power over your partner. And then we have using economic abuse. So preventing that person from getting or keeping a job, making that person ask for money, establishing or giving an allowance, taking the money without the other person knowing, and not letting that person know about or have access to family income. And using economic abuse can also take some other forms as well, including hiding somebody's car keys in the morning so they can't get to work on time, and then they have lost wages or lost productivity. It could also be keeping somebody up late at night in a fight or on the phone to prevent or to sabotage that person's performance on a work meeting the next day or on a big test or a big meeting. Using economic abuse can take a lot of forms. And then excuse me, there's one that is not on this wheel that I always like to talk about. Oops. And that is digital abuse. Digital abuse has come out way more since the pandemic has started, and as we are all communicating a lot more digitally or on different platforms with each other. So digital abuse can include monitoring communications, demanding sexual photos, excessively texting somebody, hacking. And when I say hacking, I mean going through somebody's phone when they're not in the room, or going through messages or DMs or whatever it might be. It's posting private images or messages. It's demanding check-ins with that partner. It's tracking location and posting cruel things about a partner as well. And I want to go back to and kind of pause on two of these for a quick second. Tracking location. This is one that comes up anytime I give this presentation, because a lot of people, say, hey, Zoe, tracking location, it could be a good thing, right? For safety. And I agree. I have my location on for my parents. I have it on for my friends as a safety precaution. But when tracking location is used as a tactic of power and control, that's when it becomes digital abuse. So saying things like, hey, I noticed you made a stop on your way home from work. Where did you go? Who did you see? Or I notice it's at 5 o'clock on the dot, and I notice that, your little pin or your location is not moving. Where are you? When will you be home? When it's used again to have that power and control over that partner. And then the second one is the top one, monitoring communications. And I have stars by that one because, again, we want to make sure we're keeping safety in the forefront of our minds. So say, if I'm on a FaceTime call with a friend or with a loved one, and say their partner comes in and says something or does something that just gives me the ick or gives me a sense of worry about that person. If I go to text them afterwards and I say, hey, I noticed what so-and-so said, or I noticed what so-and-so did. Is everything okay? Are you okay? if that friend's partner is monitoring their communication, they could say things like, Zoe doesn't know what she's talking about. Zoe doesn't respect our relationship. I don't want you to FaceTime with Zoe when I'm around ever again. So it's always appropriate to, again, make sure we're keeping safety in our minds and to ask that loved one or friend, hey, can you call me when you're on your way home from work tomorrow? Or, hey, do you mind giving me a call, or do you mind talking with me when so-and-so is not around? Just to make sure, again, for the safety. All right, and now I'm going to transition into barriers to safety and disclosure to kind of answer this question, why does somebody stay? Why don't they just leave? And before I even get into the barriers, I want to make the note that leaving is the most dangerous time for somebody in an intimate partner violence relationship. Homicide rates go up exponentially in the time when somebody is attempting to leave. So leaving is not always the safest choice for somebody. And just to start off with the barriers, having that emotional attachment and love for that partner, this is incredibly valid. We think back to the cycle, cycle of violence, right? That honeymoon phase could last 10 years, 2 kids before tension even starts to build. And even when we think about the cycle, that maybe that honeymoon phase started somewhere, that person was charming and charismatic and wonderful, and you have love for them. And having to leave that can be really, really hard and really confusing as well. And then we have fear for own safety or safety of children or other family members. I'm going to give a trigger warning for what I'm about to say, so please take care of yourselves. But it's not uncommon for people who are experiencing this type of violence to hear, I will kill you if you try to leave, or I will kill you if you try to tell anybody, or threatening that same type of violence on a family member, or maybe on the pets in the household. So fearing for your own safety or safety of the children. It can also be staying for the sake of the children or staying for the sake of the commitment to the relationship. This is a big one that would prevent somebody from leaving, right? Maybe the kids, are 16 and, staying for the children until they go to college, there's a bunch of barriers that exist around this one as well. And then we have denial or disbelief that the abuse is even happening, or hoping for change, hoping that it will get better, hoping that if that person just goes to counseling or goes to, a social service provider, that things will change, that things will become better. And then we have distrust in authorities, and this can look like many different things. Some communities, some neighborhoods, some people do not feel safe or comfortable inviting a police presence into their space, and that is an incredibly valid reason. Sometimes the police can create cycles of harm or recreate cycles of harm for folks, and so if somebody does not want to have an increased police presence in their neighborhood or in their community, or even just in their home setting, it might prevent them, right, from accessing that service. Distrust in authorities can also look like teens not wanting to tell safe adults at school, or not wanting to tell, safe adults outside of the school, because especially for the adults in the school, mandated reporting, right? That person has to elevate that to somebody else. So that teen might not want to come forward because they know that it will be reported. Distrust in authorities can also look like somebody, not wanting to tell their coworkers or their boss what is happening, because maybe that means that there's a mark on the employee file, or maybe that means that they have to go see a system like an employee assistance program. Somebody might not be ready and might not want to invite that in as well. So distrust in authorities can take a lot of different forms. Then we have shame and embarrassment that the abuse is even happening. If any of you are Brené Brown fans, she does a phenomenal series on shame, and that shame can actually change parts in our brain and our body in this biological sense, right? And it can really prevent us from a lot of things. So if somebody has shame and embarrassment that the abuse is happening, that can really prevent somebody from coming forward. We also have these real mental health costs that come as a result of experiencing this type of violence: depression, stress, isolation, whatever it might be that might actually prevent somebody, like physically prevent somebody from coming forward and reporting or disclosing. And then we have financial resources, as I kind of mentioned, with economic abuse, income, housing, employment, transportation. We have heard that if somebody has the choice to stay with their abusive partner, or having to give up having access to the family income or to the car or even to the house, a lot of people are going to choose to stay with that abusive partner, right? Because it's access to resources. And that's, again, a very, very valid reason why somebody would stay. Oops. And then lastly, we have institutional and intersectional oppressions. So if one of the partners has been involved in the justice system before, if one of the partners has a history of substance use, and if one of the person's immigration status is at play as well, all of those things can add to the barriers that somebody might experience in trying to leave or to disclose. And as I had mentioned, on the right side of the screen, we see these tweets from the hashtag Why I Stayed campaign. And that top tweet from Beverly Gooden is the one that started this campaign. Beverly Gooden is a Black woman activist, and she took to Twitter and said, "He said he would change. He promised it was the last time. I believed him. He lied." And people followed, in that hashtag footsteps, and, added to Twitter as to why the barriers that they were experiencing as to why they would not leave as well. So I just like to bring those in as well. And then it wouldn't be a presentation with me if I did not mention intersectionality in a more intense way, or a more, deeper way. Intersectionality, for those of you who might not be familiar with this, it's a concept often used in critical theories to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, classism, are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. So if these were all of the parts of my identity, right? These are all of the parts in how I experience the world and how the world sees me. Intersectionality is all of these meeting together, right? So I just went through that list of barriers, but there might be additional barriers or different barriers for a person if they identify as an immigrant or a person with an undocumented status, if they're a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, if they're a person living in poverty or somebody who is unhoused or homeless, if they're a person of color, and if they're a man as well. Because as we know, there is so much stigma that can still exist around these certain identities, right? That might add to or take away somebody being able to access services, or even just disclose or reach out for help. And then, I didn't mention this, but intersectionality, the concept, was coined and written by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I encourage all of you, if you do not know her or aren't familiar with her work, to look her up. She's a fantastic writer as well. And now to kind of get into these last parts of the presentation, how can we help? What can we do? Because oftentimes I get people, when they join on or when they're listening to me, like, all right, Zoe, you just gave us all of this really terrible information, or this really hard information, but what steps can we take, right? What can we do as a community? What can we do as friends and loved ones? What can we do as service providers to help the people in our community experiencing this? Number one thing I would love you all to leave here with today is getting used to saying, "I believe you." We are currently living, in this social climate where we want to have all of the hard facts up front. We want to know all of the sides to the story. We want to know all of the points of view, when what we need to do sometimes is, if people are disclosing to us, saying, "I believe you. I believe your experience." Because oftentimes that person might be told every single day that nobody will believe them, or that the violence that is happening to them is justified in some capacity. So getting used to saying, "I believe you" out loud, and also getting used to saying some of these other validation and affirmation, little tidbits of, "You are not alone. It is not your fault. You matter. You matter to me. You matter to our community. I will stand by you." Even saying something like, "Wow, thank you for telling me. This must be really hard for you." And then on the bottom of the right side of the screen, we see that "How can I support you?" And it's a little bit smaller, and I wish it was bigger, because this question is directly tied to empowerment advocacy. Empowerment advocacy is what we use at DAIS, and it's essentially trusting that the survivor is the critical expert in their lives, right? That they are the one to define the critical issues going forward, that the survivor is the one to set the pace and to make the decisions best for them. It is not our job to tell them what they need, but rather to uncover with them what they need. So saying something like, how can I support you? What resources can I give you? Can also go a really long way. And then again, just some tips as well, not only for friends and loved ones, but again, if we're service providers, listening without judgment. And this one can be really, really hard. Trust me, I know, especially if we are friends and loved ones and we hear this and we're like, I hate that person. Or maybe we want to say, I wish I could just beat that person up, for doing this to you. That might not be helpful, right? That might not be what somebody wants to hear. So listening without that judgment, or, maybe we're listening and we're thinking, oh man, how did it get this bad? Or why has this person not left them yet? Again, that all adds to that judgment. Again, believing their story, sharing your concern for their safety. And again, it's when appropriate, somebody might not be ready to hear that they should access a service like DAIS, or that they should call DAIS, or that they might even be, in an intimate partner violence situation, or that you're worried about their safety. So again, just making sure we navigate when that's appropriate. Supporting their decisions, whatever it might be. And this one again is really, really hard, because we could meet with a client for an hour and come up with a safety plan. And then at the end of that meeting, that person says, oh, my partner is here to pick me up, right? It can be really hard to see that person leave our office and go with that partner after we just created a safety plan. It can also be really hard as friends and loved ones, right? To see that person stay with their partner, but wanting to support the fact, again, that they know their situation the best, they know their safety the best. And again, like I had mentioned, remembering that leaving is not always the safest choice, providing resources, and leaning into this idea that you do not need to be an expert in domestic violence. I definitely recognize, right, that if friends, loved ones, clients are telling us what is happening to them, we go into this mode of wanting to say, oh, I got to get them this resource, or, oh, I want to give them all of this information. Or maybe you're sitting there with fear of, I don't know how to reply to this. Lean into that fact that you don't have to be an expert. There are experts in our community that exist for this reason, and that doing the job of just being a supportive listener, a supportive friend, or a supportive loved one is enough. And so for those of you who are either service providers joining in on this call, or for those of you who are just curious about how referring works to DAIS, all of our referrals should come through our 24/7 anonymous and confidential helpline. And I'll also mention the text line in just a second. But if somebody does text our text line looking for a referral or looking to get connected to services, the advocate on the text line will ask that person to call the helpline to complete the referral, just again for confidentiality and safety purposes. And we need clients present during the call, not just on their behalf. This idea of calling with and not for. So for an example, if X organization calls us and says, hey, I have this client, can you give them a call? They're experiencing domestic violence and I want to get them connected. Here's their number. We cannot call that client. We can't accept kind of third-party referrals, besides from our LEAP program, which is our law enforcement advocacy program. But you can call with that person in your office, or wherever you might be with that person, and you can say, hey, I'm here with this person, but we need to make sure we have the verbal confirmation from the client to confirm with our helpline advocate that they would like services. And I know this can be a little frustrating sometimes. I definitely recognize that as service providers. And should we want to kind of have a triage support network, what we would then need to do is you can just reach out to us, and we would need a release of information or an ROI completed between the client and that other service provider as well. And so lastly, to go through our services, we have our 24-hour, again, fully anonymous, fully confidential helpline, 251-4445. And we just launched our 24-hour, fully anonymous, fully confidential text line as well, too. And the text line gives all of the same services as, the helpline would, and it's real people answering these texts. It's not a bot service. It's not a computer service. It is real advocates that are answering our texts. So say, you don't feel comfortable calling the helpline, or say, you get off this presentation today and you're like, man, I wish I could just have that power and control wheel, but I don't remember Zoe's, contact information. You can text our text line and say, hey, can you send me over that document of the power and control wheel? We also opened up the text line and created this text line as well, because we know that the biggest population experiencing the highest rates of domestic violence are really in that 16 to 24, that kind of teen and college population. And they might be less likely to call our helpline. It might feel like a lot for them. So having that avenue to text us has been awesome. We also offer case management services, and somebody does not need to be living in our shelter to receive case management. We have a number of community case management clients as well. We also offer support groups that happen twice a week on Thursday evenings and Friday afternoons. And those support groups can be accessed just by calling our helpline and saying, hey, I want to sign up for, support group this evening. We'll take a first, last name and a safe phone number. And again, we keep this data confidential. And that is only if, for, again, safety purposes. And then we have legal advocacy. So we are not attorneys. We can't give legal advice, but we can help with restraining orders, no contact orders. We can accompany people to court, and we can just help kind of provide that natural advocacy around the legal system. I know for me, legal jargon can be very confusing. And so our legal advocates do a phenomenal job of helping folks navigate that system. We also offer this really cool program through our legal advocacy department called Court Watch, where we sit in on injunction hearings and we rate and code the judges, the DA, and the court commissioner, I believe. And we present those findings back to all of them at the end of the year. And the best part about that report is that they listen to us. So we have seen some great strides be done for, the judicial system in Dane County, with judges reaching out to us to say, hey, I would like this report. I would like to have a conversation with you all on how we can best provide victim services. And then we have parent, child, and youth advocacy. So we have a great kids space at our building, and that can be accessed for, kiddos of parents living in shelter or kiddos of parents accessing support groups as well. We also offer parent advocacy as well, because we know that it's very, very hard to parent when somebody is in active crisis. And then we have our domestic violence shelter, or our homicide prevention shelter. And we are the only domestic violence shelter in Dane County. So we are unfortunately always at capacity. And we do have a wait list, but it is not first come, first serve. It is done based off of a risk assessment form. And then the last two parts of this are my job, primary prevention and outreach and education. As Melinda mentioned at the beginning, the primary prevention program we have housed at DAIS is called Men's Club. And MENS, again, stands for Men Encouraging Nonviolent Strength, where I work with middle and high school male identified youth in their journey growing up male. So toxic masculinity, healthy masculinity, what it means to grow up as male. But the overarching goal of that program is to build up these young men as leaders in their school communities and as allies in ending gender-based violence while providing a safe and supportive space. And then for outreach and education, I do presentations like this to anybody in Dane County who is looking to have them. As Melinda mentioned as well, no group is off limits if you want us to be brought in. So please reach out to me if you'd like to schedule a presentation. And all of our services at DAIS are free and confidential. And all of our services are available to anyone in Dane County experiencing intimate partner violence as well. Oh, and then lastly, I just did want to touch on the Men's Club for a quick second. So like I mentioned, working with middle and high school male identified youth, our 2021-2022 school year was incredibly successful, and one of our first full years back in person. So that was so exciting as well. And our current sites for these schools for this program includes La Follette High School, Memorial High School, East High School, O'Keefe Middle School, and Whitehorse Middle School as well. And then lastly, the gateway to all of the services that I just mentioned that DAIS provides is through that 24-hour, fully anonymous, fully confidential helpline or text line. And what I have found is that it is super easy just to put these numbers into your phone as a contact. And then that way, if you're in a situation or if somebody discloses to you, you don't have to do a Google search. You don't have to be like, oh, I saw this presentation with the numbers, but rather that you already have the contact in your phone, and all you have to do is send that contact to that person. And I also just want to highlight some additional community resources that are also doing phenomenal work in our communities and surrounding communities. 2 especially, or 3 especially, that I want to highlight is Freedom Inc. Y'all do amazing work in this community, and I am such a big fan. And then we also have Deaf Unity as well too. So for those in our community who identify as deaf, that is a great resource. And then also the Strong Hearts Native Helpline as well too, for those in our community who identify as Native or Indigenous. And then lastly, thank you all so much for listening to me. Thank you all so much again for logging on and for being here. This is my contact information, so please feel free to use it if you would like to be, if you would like your organization or your business to have a presentation from me, or just generally if there's more stuff that you want to talk about with me from this presentation. My email is always open, and please use me as a resource as you need. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen in case there are questions. And again, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Zoe, very much for that energetic and very informative presentation. We very much appreciate it. I know I was learning stuff even earlier when I was looking through your PowerPoint. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. If anybody has a question, feel free to put that in the chat. Otherwise, I have a couple, but I don't want to hog the airspace if there's any chat. So I'll just pause 1 second and see if anybody puts anything in the chat. All right, nothing there yet. So I get to ask more questions. I am personally very curious about the men's program. I know you went over it a bit more, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about like how it got started, how it was maybe affected by COVID, and then if there's, because it's the men supporting violence group, if there's sort of any similar type groups for people that identify as women or girls or female. Thanks.
Yes. So I guess the first part of that was Men's Club was started from a grant from the CDC called the Delta Grant. And it was started, and then we got that grant to create curriculum. So we do have a copyrighted curriculum that again is housed at DAIS. It's 9 parts that go through kind of identity formation, who are we, all the way through bystander intervention, teen dating violence, and a cool media analysis. There's a lot of really fun stuff in the curriculum. So that's kind of how it got started. And then it was definitely impacted, by COVID. We definitely had groups still meeting, even though they were online. But what we were really noticing is that, just the burnout rates for our youth were very, very high when the pandemic started. So we were able to close out that kind of first year before everybody was sent home in March. And then we just finished out those clubs online for that year. And then we started a lot of them online for the next year. But then 2021, 2022 brought the ability for us to be, brought back into the schools. Of that jazz. But we got to be back in person, which was really cool. And then this year, we were just able, we're all systems go this year as well too. And as far as that these groups exist for young women, yes. And I know of some local organizations that are doing that work, just not right off the top of my head. But I do want to highlight Whitehorse Middle School in particular, because I believe that they do have a group running for young women as well. So I know the work is being done. And if any of you in the community are doing it, please connect with me so I can highlight that work as well.
I have a couple more questions. Sorry. Just very specifically, I'm trying to picture the groups and how they're done. So they're primarily at the high schools and middle schools. Are the people, the participants choosing to go? Is it because of a referral somehow, or how are people getting involved in the groups?
Yeah, so what the structure looks like is I meet once a week for about a full class period. So usually 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the school. And I am matched with a male identified co-facilitator at the school site. So usually a social worker, a guidance counselor, a support staff person, or a teacher who has a free period. And oftentimes the work of identifying the students is done on the school side. And the only kind of caveat that I give is just students who have untapped leadership potential. I welcome a variety of opinions into the space. I welcome a variety of experiences. Somebody doesn't have to check X, Y, and Z to be part of the group. And then we meet, and I run them as voluntary groups. So if a student, especially if a young man is coming to school and they're like, I would rather do anything else than talk about masculinity for an hour, they have the ability, to not come that week and just join us back the next week as well. Because again, I don't want to add to any burnout, that our students are facing.
Thank you very much. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I think your presentation and information is so thorough. You're answering any questions that anybody thought they might have had. So that's always good. It's just me sitting here with all these questions, apparently. I don't want to forget to put the post survey. So I will put that in the chat in a minute. But so while I work on that, I'm just curious about whether there's any other areas that DAIS is hoping to grow, looking for maybe support. We're part of the Violence Prevention Coalition. DAIS is part of the Violence Prevention Coalition. Are there other agencies that could connect with DAIS on certain and expanding some services, or collaborating and supporting some services that you're aware of? And I'm sorry to throw that out to you with no warning.
No problem at all. I think like in general, all of our departments at DAIS welcome any type of connection. One of the things that all of us have a united front on is connecting with as many people as possible. We want to make sure that those in our community experiencing this type of violence are connected to as many resources as they can get. So please, if you want to reach out with us, if you want to build connections, please reach out. I would love that. And then I can connect you either, to legal or to crisis intervention or case management, whoever might be best fit for that connection as well. And I can't remember, there was another part to the question that I had a really good answer for. Oh, I wanted to mention that we are hiring as well too right now. We have a ton of positions open. So we want to make sure that if you are interested in this work, if you have a passion for this work, please look at applying. And to apply, you just go to abuseintervention.org. And then I believe it's under the Work With Us tab. And we have everything right there on the website to make it easy for submitting, a resume, a cover letter, and just generally filling out that application right on our website as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And I can't remember if there was another part of my question either. So we are coming up on time. So I do want to thank everyone for being here with us today over your lunch hour. I know hopefully everybody was able to eat while they were watching and listening. And thank you very much, Zoe, for your thoughtful presentation. This session again was recorded and will be available on the Madison-Dane County Public Health website before the end of the week. We're asking for feedback on the event. I did put the link in the chat and I will send it out by email to everyone that registered. We're really hoping that you can take a minute or so to just fill out that. It does help us. It does help inform us. We did get some feedback on a previous session about ideas for a next session. And sometimes in sessions like this, I'm thinking of a lot of ideas where I could bring Zoe or somebody from DAIS back to even expand more on a certain topic or issue. So if you have thoughts like that, or if you want your organization to be considered to present, definitely say that as well. Also, in that note, please mark your calendars, because on November 16th, we will have a representative from Rape Crisis Center who's going to be here to talk to us about their organization and their violence prevention efforts as well. So thank you very much for all of that. Zoe, is there any last minute words? I don't want to close out the webinar when you're mid sentence or anything like that.
Just a huge thank you to everybody, and once again a thank you to everybody on the Public Health Madison-Dane County side as well too. Thank you all for doing this.
All right, thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you to everybody for listening. And I will be sending out an email with contact information, and the survey and information about upcoming speaker series events. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.